I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2019-98, ordinance regarding temporary cold weather shelters. Let's go ahead and start with introductions, starting with you, Pete.
Mr. Peterson.
John Welton.
Crystal Kennedy. Meg Zalatal.
Forrest Dunbar.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Felix Rivera.
Rebecca Wynn-Pearson, Municipal Attorney.
Dean Dixon.
And then it's my understanding that we have some shelter providers in the audience. If we could have folks introduce themselves.
Susie Pearson from Awake.
Scott Lingle, Beans Cafe.
Richard Irwin. Checker.
Robin Dempsey, Catholic Social Services, Brother Francis and Perhaps.
Okay.
Maureen Howell, Health Department.
All right. Great. Thanks, everyone. Are you ready?
Yeah, if you want me to start. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, we're ready for you.
Sure. Okay. Let me just plug myself in. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I've invited Maureen to come sit with me as a representative of the Health Department because she is the best suited to answer any specific questions that come up about the sheltering program itself. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the history of kind of how we got to this place in our current code, and then what we have proposed today through a collaborative effort of our members of the Assembly and members of the administration for moving forward with emergency sheltering under a municipal code. So the first question, how did we get here? What we're doing, the ordinance that we're looking at today is effectively a revision of what is currently the cold weather plan for homeless persons under Title 16, which came into being in 2010. Proposed by Mayor Sullivan's office in order to create a backup plan for life safety when the weather was particularly bad in the municipality. The original cold weather plan was activated at a temperature of 15 degrees and then was changed in the course of the legislative process by the Assembly to be activated at 32 degrees. In 2010, so that's what was enacted. And interesting, I think the rationale at the time was really about allowing churches to house, to shelter families. And the legislative history says that in the winter of 2009-2010, we had family sheltering needs that were particularly pressing, and that the faith-based community was interested in partnering with the municipality to provide housing, and so that's what the legislative history at least relays as where we started. We're looking for likely church-based solutions for families. In 2012, the temperature was revisited specifically, that there was a small change made from 32 degrees as the threshold for cold weather sheltering to 45 degrees, with the clear rationale being that exposure, hypothermia, and other climate risks are significantly present above 32 degrees in our state, as we all know that 32 to 45 degree range can really lead to adverse health effects as well. So then that stayed on the books for about 5 years. In 2017, the Assembly passed this ordinance, which there was a lot of back and forth in the recitals. I wasn't here at this point, so maybe someone who was can enlighten me as to what was going on with the recitals. There was a lot of back and forth on the intent of the AO. At the end of the day, what it did was really simple. It effectively said that any shelter or any facility designated as a cold weather shelter can continue to provide overnight shelter for a continuous period. I should add one specific caveat, which I also thought was interesting in looking at the legislative history. Down at the bottom here, it's important to note that this only applied to social service facilities. So this extension did not allow churches to shelter year-round. It simply allowed social service facilities. The code deals with a couple different categories of facilities that are allowed to provide cold weather sheltering. So 2017, the extension was specifically to social service facilities. And the issue at that time was just simply a need for space. And the legislative history actually calls out the need to keep a few specific social service facilities open year-round in order to protect life and safety, health and safety of individuals who are living on the streets. So again, we started with churches. It kind of turned into a need for social service facilities. Each time it's been reiterated the need for additional sheltering in the municipality, particularly in times of a crisis level need in the homelessness community. 2019, this past summer, we all know this was further extended by this body through September 1st, 2019, pending some sort of more permanent solution. Quick segue, what does the program actually look like? The Department of Health and Human Services, formerly Department of Health and Human Services, now Health Department, administers the program. They have an actual cold weather plan for homeless persons. Clearly this would be revised if the changes we're discussing today are enacted. For a program to participate, there's an application form, insurance requirements, a plan for operations that's outlined in the code that must be filed with the department and reviewed. And there's also specific fire department provisions that are in place regarding that a shelter has to qualify under in order to be able to have people sleeping in the space overnight. So what are we proposing today? You should all have in front of you a draft of 2019-98S. So there are some changes. This is a draft. This is not the finalized version. It hasn't been submitted into the queue. This is a discussion draft based on some preliminary feedback from assembly members who are involved and also from the administration, subject to continuing revision before the public hearing on this matter. And this is an ordinance which would effectively codify the process that we have been doing ad hoc since 2017. So since 2017, we've recognized the need for some kind of relief valve, some kind of emergency sheltering provision in code, and we've accomplished that through a blanket extension of the cold weather sheltering plan as it pertains only to social service facilities. And what this provides for, what we're seeking to provide here, is a more transparent and fixed, codified structure for the extension of emergency sheltering, not just in cold weather situations, but also in other situations of dire need, again, as defined in code and as overseen by the health department. Before I walk through what that code, what the proposed ordinance does, I want to take a moment to comment on why we've moved to the word emergency sheltering. If you'll see in the ordinance that the new category of sheltering we're dealing with here is called emergency sheltering. And the reason we're using that word is threefold. First, it comports with what we understand to be applicable terminology in sheltering, looking at the HUD regulations in the CFR, emergency shelters defined to mean any facility, the primary purpose of which is to provide a temporary shelter for the homeless in general, or for specific populations of the homeless, which does not require occupants to sign leases or occupancy agreements. So effectively, all the sheltering we providing in this context is emergency sheltering. This is also a term that mirrors internal health department practice. The health department has a protocol and documentation structures around what they do when they declare some kind of public health emergency. This doesn't involve a mayoral declaration of emergency. This is simply a health department can do this when they see this public health emergency situation. So this terminology would dovetail with existing structures and terminology at the health department. It also aligns with the legislative intent that this not be a route to some kind of constant practice to allow for this sheltering at all times, or effectively a revision to Title 21, which would be required to make sheltering always an accessory use in these locations, but to make clear that this is effectively something that can be done in response to emergency level conditions specifically in the homelessness arena. So not necessarily always that we having to have an emergency in the municipality as a whole, but that it would be emergency conditions in the sheltering world would lead to the ability to trigger this plan, the applicability of this plan. So looking at the ordinance itself, if you want to walk through it starting on page 1, and I apologize, our printer for some reason only printed the D and the A and the T of draft, so DAT is what we have on the page. I apologize. So the first change we've done again is reframe this as an emergency shelter plan for homeless persons as opposed to specifically a cold weather plan. Again, this mirrors what we've been doing for the past several years. The goal here is transparency, clarity about what the criteria are so that we are being straightforward in our codified law about what we're actually doing. And so again, we reframe this to be not simply based on outside temperatures, but based on effectively an emergency and the availability of shelter. We removed the immediate qualifier for danger because even the cold, we felt like that was perhaps a overzealous terminology that isn't even effectively, applicable right now. A 45-degree temperature does not immediately cause danger to an individual, but it does cause danger over time if someone is exposed. So we felt like that was an unnecessary qualifier. The important meat of the change is on page 2, 16.120.020A. Creates 3 different criteria that will trigger the emergency sheltering plan. The first is the same as in code right now, automatically when the outside temperature drops to 45 degrees or below. The second is at the discretion of the mayor during declaration of a civil emergency. So of any kind, this can be triggered. All these locations could be used as shelter if needed during a civil emergency. During the earthquake, for instance, we actually had a number of unhoused individuals who sought emergency shelter. So it is something that is needed for all Lakewood residents housed and unhoused during civil emergency, regardless of the type. Number 3, and the third is when the director of the health department determines in writing that a lack of available shelter options poses a danger to the life and health of unsheltered people within the municipality. And this is effectively the emergency protocol within the department, the health department. So whenever the director basically sort of declares a mini health department emergency in writing, then she can trigger the activation of this emergency sheltering plan. Subsection B talks about when this would expire. The main caveat that we've added is a deactivation timeline of no less than 7 days, acknowledging that if we're expecting people to prefer to move to temporary shelter over living in camps, that if they might have to leave a shelter with 24 hours notice or less, at the moment the temperature rises or the moment an emergency declaration by the health department is rescinded, that's untenable, and that would potentially lead rational people to say, I'd rather live in a camp where I might have 10 days notice before I have to leave. So there's sort of 2 layers of this, and this layer here in 16.120.020 makes clear that the health department will give providers at least 7 days notice prior to saying we're deactivating the plan. So when we deactivate from the municipality, we'll say we're deactivating right now, it's gotten above 45 degrees, or we see there's no longer emergency conditions, but you providers, you get at least 7 days notice to know that you're going to have to demobilize. We've added in 16.120.030 2 things. One, we've just moved what was formerly subsection A or subsection A2 to be subsection A1 little d, simply an organizational piece. I'm not sure why that was originally subsection 2. That's really, I think, a change without too much consequence except bringing like kind terms together. We added subsection 2 to make clear that this cross-references the marijuana-related industries. We've run into some issues where if something suddenly turns into a different use, like by virtue of becoming a temporary shelter, then suddenly the marijuana-oriented business that's less than 500 feet away becomes illegal. And so this was a request to try and make clear that this doesn't necessarily make these, change the use of these things in these structures into homeless and transient shelters, which is a protected land use under the marijuana code.
Before you go on, Mr. Constant.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to clarify in the first part, O2O there. So we talk about 7 days and 24 hours. That doesn't mean if somebody has someone who is somehow not safe or proper to be in their place, they have to allow them to stay for 7 days in the same way that when we have someone camped in the woods, we have to give them proper notice, right? We aren't creating a status for them in which the operator has to provide for these individuals individually place?
No, not at all. Through the chair, there's two pieces of the deactivation planning, the 7 days notice piece. The piece we've already gone over only concerns notice from the health department to the provider and says we have to give you at least 7 days notice before you have to deactivate, acknowledging that people who are running shelters pursuant to this also need time to deactivate and shouldn't be required to do so immediately. And then the piece we haven't gotten to yet is on page 4, where we talk about when there is the actual type of plan that an individual social service facility or religious assembly must submit in order to become qualified as an emergency shelter. With this new requirement says that the plan shall indicate that they have to give occupants who are actively living there 7 days notice prior to standard voluntary closure or deactivation, and that they can close down. So, for instance, if just because you qualified as an emergency shelter and can remain open for the duration of an emergency, it may mean you don't want to. You a church may be able to only do it during a season that isn't the holidays or something. So they could elect to voluntarily close, but here all this says is that if they've elected to do voluntary closure, they have to give people who are in residence at the time notice we're closing in 7 days, unless there are exigent circumstances approved by the director, in which case they can close. There's nothing in here that says an individual resident may not be restricted for cause.
I just want to make sure that's
there
clear
and
on
all.
the record. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask Mr. Wilson.
Yes, Mr. Wilson.
Thanks for bringing that back up, Chris. So on B, this deactivation, it's not clear to me that that's notice from the city to the providers. It'd be nice to clear that up. But so if we, like we did, we declared emergency and we said it'll still end on X date, is that kind of sufficient? Now they know that date and they've got their 7 days notice.
Well, the emergency would be declared by, the way that this contemplates an emergency declaration, it comes from the director of the health department, and it contemplates her making a determination that circumstances exist such that there is a danger to life and health of unsheltered people that merits the use of this emergency shelter plan. And determination, deactivation, is contemplated as when the director then subsequently determines. I think the way that we're envisioning this is that it would, again, only be an emergency situation, so she wouldn't really be able to say, I anticipate an emergency for the next 3 months. She'd say, there is an emergency right now, and then depending on changes in circumstances, she would then issue a subsequent termination and say, I've determined that we can deactivate the plan because, a new shelter has just come online, or whatever it is that has happened that has allowed for the emergent circumstances. Fire danger has diminished. We no longer have to make sure we can get everybody out of the green belt. Whatever it is that's triggered the emergent circumstances have dissipated. I'm sure there may be a circumstance where she could say time limited, and then I think it probably would be. But you also raise a good point. I can clarify that it is 7 days notice to operating emergency shelters from the health department.
And I missed point 2. That actually, you have 1, 2, upon expiration of the relevant declaration of 7 months.
Yep.
Okay. No, this is good.
Continuing, the bottom of page 3. Oh, also note one of the edits I've made in here is again simply an update that the new Title 21 refers to religious assemblies as opposed to churches as the defined use. So I've added that. Old Title 21 continues to refer to churches. So the reason that both terms are left in here is that the locations downtown are still churches under Title 21. Anyone outside of downtown is a religious assembly. Subsection B makes clear that the health department has the discretion to rescind the designation with or without cause. This is designed to allow the health department some oversight over who gets to remain in an emergency shelter. And then concluding on page 4, again, where the piece we had just previously touched on, that when an applicant is applying to become an emergency shelter, the sheltering plan submitted is required to provide for a minimum of 7 days notice to occupants prior to voluntary closure or to deactivation, or 72 hours with the consent of the director of the health department, acknowledging that sometimes we've had, I understand we've had a church where they had an unanticipated mission group that was going to come on short notice, and they needed to say, look, we can't have people in our space anymore, they've got to get out of here. We would certainly acknowledge that that's something that the director could approve, but we don't want to leave that 72-hour option open all the time. Again, back to this point of making sure that people who are choosing to be in an emergency shelter instead of in a green belt are getting the same level of notice before, or approximately the same level of notice before needing to vacate a situation. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions. Maureen can answer more detailed questions about how the sheltering program currently works, or how the health department see this working, and I'd also defer to the sponsors anything they might want to say about the ordinance.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to point out, I think it's important to look at this ordinance in two parts. There's activation and designation, and so sometimes it gets a little bit confusing. So that last section is just about being designated as shelter, and that be rescinded. It doesn't mean that it's different than the activation. So I just want to make sure that that's really clear. We have how you get activated and deactivated, and then you have the process for getting designated, which could be rescinded.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Zalatel. Any further questions? Mr. Whittleton.
Maybe you're getting this way, but how many places are designated shelters, whatever we call it now?
So at this point in time, I believe there's 9 churches. Dave Piper couldn't be here today. He's the faith-based liaison that you all know very well that works with the church community for family emergency weather sheltering. He's in the process of validating that list for us, but we have about 9 churches for families. There's several facilities that have been approved in the past for individual sheltering, and that's been the Anchorage Safety Center and Beans Cafe have both, the Stoltz Building at one time as well. So they're the ones that are, and Downtown Hope. Those are the ones that are on the list right now.
So, maybe don't tell us, but I mean, how do they, or all 9, gosh, you got closed, all 9 open up, or do 2 of them open up, and then we'll do it for 2 weeks, and then you pick it up, or do they rotate through?
So if we're talking about the churches and families, what typically happens is they are open most generally the first week in October, and then are generally open through April 15th, and there's 1 church on per night, more times than none, 7 days a week. So again, Dave is going to be validating that list of churches for us, but we anticipate there'll be a church on every night for families.
But it's not the same one?
Not the
so
same one.
I sit here, and then they tell me, okay, go to this church tomorrow.
Right.
Is that good, or is that, gosh, we'd rather have one church just do it constantly?
Well, there's mixed feelings on that. That's the best network that we've been able to put together at this point in time. I mean, certainly, any system can be improved, but it is what we have that is working, at this point in time. So.
And for anyone listening, I think it's amazingly generous that any group does this. So I'm not faulting anyone who doesn't.
It is a very, very
200
amazing.
days a year.
Yes, and there are several other providers that are very involved in that work as well. For instance, Awake is who takes those calls after hours and triages those families and arranges for transportation to get them to the church that's on duty. So it's very much a community sort of system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
One other variable to understand about what's happening, not only are we working to comport our code with our actual practice, which makes this emergency shelter not just cold weather shelter, but also we are opening the types of entities that can provide this or can apply under this section of the code. So it's no longer just churches or social service organizations, but other entities as well can apply, which is important because by only focusing on that narrow bandwidth of organizations, I think we leave out some things that we kind of contemplate with, like the Elks Lodges and Moose Lodges, places that don't have a social service function but could serve in this capacity. And the other thing that we are attempting to do is broaden the vulnerability level, or for lack of a better term, the barrier level of who can come into these places, and create some environments that aren't as high barrier as only sober children and families, right? Because we miss a lot. There are a lot of people out in the encampments who aren't quite in that area. And so I think that this is a good step in that direction.
Thank you. Ms. Zalatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To follow up, if folks are shifting from church to church by the night, I'm not sure that works here, I think we need to talk through that, if that's practically what's happening, because we're talking about folks being, I mean, they don't have a place by right per se, but we're saying we want the shelters open for a minimum of 7 days, absent exigent circumstances, which would deactivate again in 72 hours. So, or am I overthinking it?
That's a good point. I mean, I think I didn't realize that nuance as we were drafting. I think what I would say is we should add a caveat that provides for the current structure, because I think the current structure is potentially what churches can do. And so I think what we want is a church that's open every Monday, to not be like, well, sorry, we're not going to be open next Monday, Sunday night, right? So I would say that our notice horizons still apply. I'll go back and look at the language and make sure we don't need another caveat to say. Again, I think the same. We don't want a sudden closure if the Monday night church is expected to house people and then can't. But again, I don't think we can or should force a structure where churches that have been doing this great thing and letting people in every Monday night now aren't able to provide any shelter because they're not doing it every night of the week, personally. And I think that the administration's feeling is that.
Yeah, maybe we could have some language that talks about, I don't know, cooperative group of designated facilities or something activated together, or something that in that discretion it's activated in a particular way by the health department that recognizes the structure. Because I could see that would possibly apply, as Mr. Constant said, if we had, like, for example, an Elks Lodge, but we may have it actually staffed or volunteered by a church group whose facility can't. So we can really open up that opportunity for collaborations and partnerships within the community to create more space. So, okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. On the same subject, Mr. Constant?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I don't think that what's written here excludes the current practice, and so I don't think you're going to find in there some explicit language that bars allowing people to do what works for them. So I think that while it certainly is interesting and different than might have been thought about, I think the language is square. You might find
sorry, through the chair, clarification, I don't think there's anything here that prohibits the current structure. I was going to perhaps make a clear caveat that, make it clear in here that this new language is not intended to clearly carve out the fact that it's possible to operate periodically, like every Monday and Tuesday, and not run afoul of this 7 days notice or 72 hours notice requirement.
Thank you. So I put myself in the queue. So I don't see a C attached to this ordinance. Obviously, this ordinance isn't sort of promoting the use of funds, but I'm curious, what is the current funding for these, and how is that? How are those funds dispersed and used?
We're going to talk first to the C piece, and then I'll defer to Maureen. There is a C that was attached to the original version. I apologize for not bringing it with the S version, and it contemplates. So went into the queue when the original was introduced. It contemplates one additional position in the health department that would administer this. The current situation with these structures. So again, an important distinction about this ordinance is this ordinance doesn't actually create any emergency shelter beds. It simply allows organizations that are eligible who decide they would like to provide emergency shelter to do so. So the only funding we're contemplating at this point is for someone within the health department to do this, because if we anticipate opening the doors to this process broader than they currently are open, we anticipate needing to provide more support from that level of support.
Yes, so that would be the C attached part. As far as other funding related specifically to shelter, the churches do this on a volunteer basis for families. When we enact overflow shelter, as an example, that comes with a cost, and we've been able to figure that out in the past. Is the best way that I can describe that as far as how we have funded that in the past. So, yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Constant.
So you just brought back a term that I think we are maybe in an effort to get rid of, and that's the word overflow. And so now we have shelter, we have emergency shelter. What differentiates overflow then in your mind?
Well, my mistake.
Well, we discussed this extensively when deciding on the appropriate term for this plan trigger, and decided as I went through my presentation for 3 different reasons to use the term emergency. One other reason we elected specifically specifically to not use the term overflow is because we functionally lack the capacity and the ability to trigger these shelters only when all other shelters are full. So when these shelters are open, we can't really require people to go to this shelter first and not this shelter or track. It just becomes, it is untenable. It's structurally untenable to operate in that regard. So we instead went with an emergency trigger where again the director of the health department can make an informed decision that right now we're in crisis conditions, so I am triggering this plan. But it's not specifically overflow shelter. People may elect to go to these shelters first, and then it will end up being the standard, sheltering that's open all the time that will effectively be overflow, the people who can't get into these shelters. But we don't have the power or the capacity to direct people to one shelter before we open the doors of another shelter.
Mr. Chair, just quickly, I think though there is a distinction that I just heard and we should contemplate, and it doesn't really fall under this ordinance, but it's what we have intended to spend a substantial sum of funds on, that we took those funds and applied to the continuing operation of just our baseline shelters. And that is when we find ourselves in a position where there is no more capacity available at all of our standard shelters and there's no capacity through this voluntary system, there's still that difference. And I don't know if it needs a name, but we need to be able to have discussions about that piece, because I think that's the piece Mr. Rivera was referring to, the costs, other than are there costs to this voluntary stuff, but there's also this other side. And so to me, there's still
certainly
missing part we need to have a conversation about at some point soon, because we spent all those dollars that were intended for that population.
Through the chair, those were our cold weather shelter. So so this allows any organization to do this. Previously, we have funded some organizations to do this.
And
that's a different
will.
piece. And so that money was designated for cold weather sheltering, which was prevented under the existing ordinance. And I agree with you that it's a different discussion, but also a discussion that needs to be had at some point by this body about what you would like to do with the funding source for whether it's cold weather sheltering specifically or emergency sheltering more generally. That is a conversation that needs to be had in light of where we are financially.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Alatel.
Thank you. Following up on that point, though, I think when we designated additional money in the first quarter budget revisions for overflow or sheltering dollars, now with this new ordinance, if it passes, will provide the opportunity to, if the health department believes we could activate this network during a time that we wouldn't normally have been able to activate the network. And I think it's worth it to have in the budget discussion if we want to rely on this versus kind of the old system. There might be an opportunity to have a conversation about what ways we can possibly incentivize also helping activate this network and more broadly as we've discussed. So I think the discussion needs to happen soon, but I think we have a factor here now that's a little bit different that lets the activation of this network happen in a time that we weren't able to before.
And Mr. Chair, if I can, I agree. There's idealism and there's realism, and it might take some years to get to a point where we have a fully functioning system where we can just depend on all these players saying we're ready to go. And we still need to be prepared for the fact that excess need of capacity is a reality that we're going to face. Even if we get 10 more of these up, it might not be enough to deal with the difference. And my neighbors just can't be you're my neighbors between us, can't be the only place that the city houses de facto this population. So I hope we get to that point sooner than later, but we need to be prepared for the reality that may come that it's not enough.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a side question along the same lines as what Mr. Constant and Mrs. Elatel have raised. How involved is it to get the certification? I see the process is itemized, or we need an Anchorage Fire Department certification, and then there's a determination on staffing, and then a plan and protocols. Do you know offhand how long it takes an organization to go through that process?
Sure. So it's not a lengthy process, and it's pretty straightforward. Currently, what the health department does is we help that process with whoever is applying to be an emergency shelter. We very much help coach that through, make sure the fire inspections are done, and we're very involved in that as organizations apply. So As far as getting through the process, depending on how quickly we can get someone there to inspect the space, we're talking a week.
Oh, wow.
Could be a little bit longer than that, but we do try to get that through. Depending on the level of emergency, we're definitely going to be very involved in making sure that we can get those facilities up and running as quickly as possible. So one of the points that were made about the attachment and the staffing is that we're currently doing that with someone within another department that helps get that through. So we're hoping as this builds out and as the system grows and as this grows that we are able to dedicate some more staff time to that.
And quick follow-up. Do you know offhand how many people the 9 designated operators house or have capacity for?
I'm not sure about their capacity. I have some reports if I can find them here, and I know I have someone in the audience that can probably. There she is. Do you have the reports with you?
I'm Jane Strait with United Way, and I work with the Church Holy Shelter Program. Last winter, the number of unique families that used Holy Shelter was 83 families. And in terms of from October 1 through about the end of April, the church system gets activated about 80% of the time. And then the capacity is set by the fire department, and the current capacity is 20. So 20 per night.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Constant.
So that raises a really kind of substantial question. If we have 85 families and 20 slots per night, where are 60 families going?
That would be, out of that list of 83 families, you would find some who, over the course of the entire winter last winter, stayed once for one night. And then you might find a family that had a much higher full crisis and they were staying a couple of weeks. So in terms of, it isn't every single night.
Not everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you. All right, do we have any other questions? Okay, thank you. I want to go ahead and, with the remainder of our time, turn it over to the shelters, see if they have any thoughts. And then if we have any time remaining after that, can entertain a few public comments. So do any of our shelters want to speak on this ordinance? Okay. Yes, Mr. Whittle.
Oh, good. Someone raised their hand. Well, I want to hear from how is it working? Can you handle the people who come in and they turn the place up? Is it working? I don't really have a sense for it. I spent 10 minutes at one of the churches when they were letting people in. That's all I know. But I'd like to get a feel for
Are you asking from our facility or
anyone who deals with it. Is anyone who's taking people in?
Richard Irwin, and I was part of the initial drafting of this ordinance way back when. And my knowledge of what happens within the context of churches is effectively gone really well, really well. Very few incidents that I'm aware of. And then I also wear another hat with the Downtown Hope Center and being able to shelter the 50 women a night, and that it's been a great way of being able to come alongside and provide services out here. So I appreciate the cooperation of the different entities involved in this.
Any further questions, Mr. Whittleton?
No.
Okay.
Hear from everyone. Does anyone argue with that? Or
Yeah. All right, so if we're not hearing from any more of the shelters, then I can go ahead and open it up public testimony. Go ahead.
My name is Rose Hubbard, and I'm an Anchorage Community Homeless Project. I've also actually had experience staying in these shelters, lived experience for the winter of 2015. It was extremely difficult because we had to be up and out at, some of them were 6:30, some of them were kind of budget and went to stay till 7, just depended on, the schedule of the building, of the other church activities. And then also, you had to wait till after a certain time period all your stuff had to be packed up, and you had to haul it around town or wherever you went, and it was basically just as bad as, actually worse than being in an encampment, because at least in an encampment, your stuff stays in one spot for the most part, and until you get that, eviction notice, it's not going anywhere. But it was very, very pleasant. All of the staff, all of the church members were extremely pleasant. I think there was only one time that we came across an individual that was out of control. Not really out of control, but just a little extra, a little too much to handle. So the church staff just asked the person to leave, and that was about it.
Thank you. Sure, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a question for Ms. Wynn Pearson. In terms of storing of possessions, if an operator wanted to offer that, is that something that's allowed already or could be permitted?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, I think it would depend on the scale and scope. If it tipped over the line to becoming something akin to, what we would classify as a storage facility under Title 21, and you were offering large-scale storage units and storing people's furniture, I think we might run into a land use issue. But to the extent the church wanted to provide cubbies for people's human belongings, I don't see that as a violation of any existing provision of the code.
Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak on this ordinance? Okay. Any final thoughts? All right, then I'll go ahead and close the work session. If you guys have any amendments, please get them in. Although we have a little bit of time, this comes back before us on the 20th.